In Philippians 4, verse 4, the Lord commands us to rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. You know, in this time, sometimes we get tempted to be discouraged. And sometimes discouragement comes in the midst of the busyness of ministry. But there's another type of temptation to discouragement when God presses the pause button on ministry. And it seems right now, today is what, day 40 that we have been sheltering in place. And I want to talk about the discouragement that may come when God presses the pause button. And we're going to look in 1 Kings chapter 19. But you know, God has often put the pause button on ministry. I mean, think about Noah. We think 40 days is bad. How about 364 days in his shelter in place? Or what about Joseph? Thrown into a pit at 17, and for 13 years, he endures waiting. Or what about Moses? 40 years, not 13, not 1 year, 40 years in the Midianite desert before God is going to fulfill a purpose to redeem his people out of Egypt. But in 1 Kings 19, we see that Elijah is one of God's priceless prophets who experiences discouragement. Look at verse 1 and 2. It says, "Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, 'So may the gods do to me, and even more if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time.'" The first few verses in chapter 19 of 1 Kings show us the cause of Elijah's discouragement. In the case of Elijah, we see his discouragement comes after one of his greatest victorious mountaintop, literal experiences. Fire had been called down from heaven. The Lord's glory had been displayed against the Baal worship. 450 Baal prophets put to death in one day. And then after 3 years and 6 months, God brings rain. And at the end of chapter 18, Elijah is running with the hand of the Lord upon him, girding up his loins. He outran Ahab to Jezreel. And then we see the first step of discouragement comes when his expectations are not met. Jezebel puts a warrant on Elijah's life. The bold prophet now becomes a fugitive prophet. And we see him move from discouragement to self-pity. Verse 3, he was afraid and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. That's like going to the edge of Death Valley, leaving behind your car and going into the wilderness. A day's journey, he sits down on a juniper tree, and it says, he sat down and requested that he might die and said, "It is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." I think Elijah had forgotten two things. First, he forgot God was in control, even when it seemed everything was not going as planned. And secondly, and most important, he forgot that as a servant, he wasn't in charge of the timeline. In fact, what he expected to happen in Israel wasn't happening according to his time. And so he sat down under that juniper tree and said, "It's just like all the others. Take my life." But notice how the Lord confronts Elijah. As he lay down and slept, behold, there was an angel touching him. And he said to him, "Arise, eat." God confronts his discouragement with grace, not a raven, an angel. And it's food, it's a heated bread cake on hot stones. Better than señorita bread. Better than Krispy Kreme. Angelic hot bread. And there it says, you're going to eat and get strength. And for 40 days, God gives him strength to meet him. And there God is waiting at the same place that he met Moses on Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. And in verse 9 it says, he came to the cave and lodged, and behold, the word of the Lord came to Elijah and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" You see, God knows exactly the time frame, the timeline, and I guess you could say the limits of our ministry. And God was waiting for Elijah. Called him by name. What you doing here, Elijah? And you can hear Elijah's discouragement in his answer. He said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altar and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. It's interesting that the word my life or life keeps getting repeated in this chapter. Jezebel says, I'm going to take out your life. He sat down and says, it's enough, Lord, take my life. And now he says, I alone am left. It's my life, my life. God is going to deal with Elijah. And I think one of the areas that we could subtly focus on our ministry more than the Lord of the ministry. And I believe Elijah is going to be gently reminded that God's purposes are completely on time. And so here we switch over to the cure for discouragement. God says, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Notice the first remedy for discouragement is to stand still before the Lord and to know his power. It's interesting. When Elijah comes out of the cave, the Lord does a display like never before. It says, behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. I mean, imagine yourself on that lonely mountain crag, and as it were, the rocks coming down upon you, fire, wind. And yet the Bible, this text emphasizes that even though Elijah felt his smallness and he felt God's power, his presence wasn't in those displays of power. And so the Lord then brings him to the point where he pauses. And it says, and after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. And in the Hebrew, it's like a whisper. And it's there that Elijah learns the second remedy for discouragement is to be still. To not rush is sometimes the best thing, because only then are we listening. And in a sense, God is revealing himself in a way that you could say he's already seen the power of God on Mount Carmel. Now he's giving a revelation of himself, of his power in the silent whisper. You see, Elijah needed to be humble before God's presence. Like the psalmist says, be still and know that I am God. He needed to remember that God was always working, even if we can't see the Lord's work. And his presence isn't always in the more obvious displays of power. In fact, it's in the pause and in the silent waiting, and it's God's still small voice where Elijah learns to trust the Lord is working in ways he couldn't imagine. And I think sometimes we need to do that. God's accomplishing his purpose for his glory and his grace. And so at the end of this display, the third remedy becomes be still and receive your orders, your ministry orders from the Lord. Notice the Lord repeats the question, what are you doing here, Elijah? And again, Elijah repeats, I've been very zealous for the Lord the God. And then he says, I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord just promptly responds with, go. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And he gives them a series of assignments. You see, Elijah perhaps began to think of his ministry as the one prophet, as the most important thing in accomplishing God's work. And yet God reminds us that it's his work and his glory and his name, and that God's right on track. Elijah was told to go, and you're going to find Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. In your place. It's not about us. You're a replaceable part, Elijah, God is saying. God can raise up another prophet and even put a double dose of his spirit upon that prophet. He appoints us for his purposes, and he appoints others to replace us. And then the Lord responds to Elijah's insistence that he himself alone was left. He replies, "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the still small voice of God, whose purposes and power are being displayed in a time where he's reserved 7,000 for his own namesake. Paul uses the same quote in Romans 11 to declare, "In the same way, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice." God is going to accomplish his work for his sake. And it's God who causes the growth. It's not about Apollos, not about Paul, not about Elijah, not about Greg, not about Phil, not about Julian. It's about God who causes the growth. And as God is moving Elijah to the place of remembering that he's just a servant and God is in control, we can rejoice. We can rejoice in our Lord, whose grace and power are infinitely greater than our limitations. So here we are, day 40. Maybe you've been discouraged, feeling useless, ready to give up. Learn from Elijah. The joy of the Lord begins with that simple hearing of the Lord's voice. Be still and know that he is God. And then trust that he's working. As a servant, it's not your job to do all the timelines and arrangements. God's in control, and his power and presence is often not where we expect. And finally, joy is made full by obeying our Lord. Remember, you're only a servant. Go and focus on being faithful in that small assignment he gives you, and rejoice that he uses others to finish what you may have started. So rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice.